January 15, 1945. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The mess hall doors swung wide, and a line of German women prisoners shuffled forward, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Among them was Annalise Weber, a 24-year-old medic from Dresden, who had once volunteered with the Wehrmacht's Medical Auxiliary Corps. She expected to find thin rations, harsh discipline, and humiliation, the things she had been told awaited her in America. Instead, she froze at the entrance, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. The air carried a scent she had not experienced since before the war. Butter sizzling on a hot griddle, the caramel sweetness of maple syrup, and the unmistakable aroma of waffles. Real thick golden waffles stacked high on trays drizzled with syrup that glistened under the fluorescent lights. Her lips parted in disbelief. She whispered to her companion, Ingrid Muller, "They serve this to prisoners." Tears welled in her eyes. It was not fear that shook her. It was the collapse of certainty. To understand Annalise's tears, you have to understand what she had been taught to believe. For years, Nazi propaganda hammered into every German ear a relentless narrative about the United States. Official newsreels portrayed America as a collapsing empire, racially divided, plagued by strikes, racked by poverty. Old Depression-era footage of bread lines was shown as if it were current. Newspapers described a mongrel nation incapable of discipline or sacrifice. Pamphlets circulated through auxiliary training schools claimed that the average American factory worker produced at 40% the efficiency of a German laborer. Annalise remembered a particular lecture during her training in 1942. An instructor held up two photographs, one of a gaunt German housewife standing proudly with her ration book and another of decadent Americans slumped in an unemployment line. The message was clear. Germany sacrificed nobly. America drowned in excess and weakness. Annalise's first real taste of contradiction came not in America, but aboard the USS West Point, a converted luxury liner used to transport prisoners. She and 64 other German women were confined to secured compartments guarded day and night. They expected bare subsistence. Instead, breakfast trays appeared bearing eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitutes that had long disappeared from German kitchens, served with white bread and pats of butter. The guards ate the same food. To Annalise's horror, one American soldier left half his bread uneaten, shrugging as if it were nothing. For a woman who had watched neighbors boil potato peels for soup back in Dresden, the sight was staggering. She scribbled in a letter later smuggled through censors. This cannot be their normal life. Surely this is theater staged to impress us. But the next day it was the same, and the next. The Atlantic crossing was only the beginning. Upon arrival at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Annalise and her companions were processed. The guards who supervised intake wore uniforms of thick wool, well-tailored, and boots that gleamed. Their weapons were standardized, well-maintained, and clearly plentiful. The prisoners were served beef stew with vegetables, steaming bowls whose meat portions equaled what a German family might receive in a week. For dessert, there was fruit, a luxury that Annalise hadn't tasted since 1940. She clutched her bowl and glanced at the waste bin where another woman's unfinished portion had been scraped away without comment. She asked an American guard if food was rationed here. He looked confused. "Well, sure, some things. Sugar, butter sometimes, but not like you mean." Annalise didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This casual attitude toward abundance was incomprehensible, but nothing prepared her for Camp Shelby and the moment that history would later remember as the Waffle Epiphany. On that January morning, the women lined up with metal trays. Annalise inhaled the scent and nearly collapsed. Waffles, soft, golden, drizzled with maple syrup, were being handed out to prisoners of war. She had grown up on waffles before the war, when her mother would cook them on Sundays, dusted with sugar. By 1942, such luxuries had vanished. Butter was scarce. Maple syrup was a memory. Flour itself was rationed so tightly that many households survived on ersatz substitutes. Yet here in captivity, the enemy offered her the taste of childhood. She whispered to Ingrid Muller. "They serve this to us." Ingrid's face was pale, her eyes glassy. The Reich had promised them starvation in America. Instead, the first bite of waffle melted on her tongue, thick with butter and syrup. Annalise's hands trembled. The tears that spilled down her cheeks were not only for hunger satisfied. They were for a worldview cracking open. The shock of the waffle was only one piece of a larger puzzle. Every corner of Camp Shelby revealed contradictions. The barracks were heated. Showers provided hot water and soap, both of which had become luxuries back home. Laundry was washed in giant electric machines that finished in half an hour, a process that still consumed hours in German hospitals. Replacement parts arrived almost immediately if something broke. For women who had lived through nightly air raids and collapsing infrastructure, the camp's routines seemed surreal. Lights stayed on, water flowed clear, the basic structures of life worked without interruption. And then there was food, always food. Breakfasts of eggs, bread, coffee with sugar and milk, sometimes fruit juice, lunches of meat, potatoes, vegetables, dinners that included desserts. On Sundays, portions doubled, and on holidays, the meals grew into feasts. At Thanksgiving, prisoners received turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pie with cream. One woman, Hildegard Peters, stared at her plate until tears blurred her vision. An American guard asked if something was wrong. She could not explain that her tears were born of impossibility. The body itself became evidence that no propaganda could refute. Within months, the women began to gain weight. Cheeks filled out, hair grew thicker, skin cleared. German medical staff among the prisoners tracked the changes. By late 1945, most had gained at least 15 pounds. Chronic conditions linked to malnutrition, respiratory infections, skin disorders, even menstrual irregularities faded. One prisoner, Johanna Metz, captured with tuberculosis, received treatment with streptomycin, an antibiotic so rare that it required special permission even in America. She was astonished. "They gave it to me, an enemy prisoner." When I asked why, the doctor simply said, "Because you're sick and we can help." The irony was brutal. These women who had once sworn loyalty to a Reich that glorified suffering were now healthier as prisoners than they had been as free citizens. Word spread from nearby men's camps. German infantry Sergeant Karl Brenner, 7 months into captivity, looked nothing like the skeletal POWs depicted in German propaganda. His face was full, his frame broader. He explained casually, "They worked 8 hours a day, earned camp scrip, bought cigarettes and beer, and ate the same rations as American soldiers." Annalise listened in disbelief. No stage parades, no coerced confessions, just routine, work, pay, food, rest. It wasn't kindness as propaganda. It was simply policy. For some, denial clung stubbornly. Emma Fischer, a devoted Nazi and communication specialist, insisted the food and comfort were illusions staged to break morale. "They're showing us a false prosperity," she hissed. But weeks passed. Meals stayed the same. Supplies kept arriving. Guards came and went, all living the same standard of comfort. Slowly, denial cracked. Some prisoners pivoted to new theories. America would collapse after the war, drowned by its own excess. But then came news of America's post-war boom. The hardest truth to accept was not that Germany had lost, but that everything they had been told about their enemy was false. One moment crystallized the revelation. Frieda Schultz, a former administrator, befriended Mary Jenkins, an American WWII supervising the camp library. Mary showed her photographs of her family home in Ohio, a modest 2-story house, a garden, a car in the driveway. Ordinary, Mary shrugged. To Frieda, it looked like wealth. In Germany, such a home would belong to professionals or minor nobility. Mary's father was a factory worker. Ordinary Americans lived lives better than German officers. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The war had not been lost because Germans were weak, but because America's systems, its factories, its farms, its logistics were simply bigger, faster, and more consistent. By the end of 1945, Annalise Weber was no longer the woman who had whispered in awe at a tray of waffles. She was heavier, healthier, and more conflicted than ever. Her diaries, like those of Ingrid Muller and dozens of others, chart a journey from disbelief to reluctant acceptance. First, denial. This cannot be real. Then anger. We have been deceived. Then bargaining. Perhaps this is only theater. Then depression. Our sacrifices may have been meaningless. Finally, a quiet, painful acceptance. This is their normal. This is reality. The waffles were never just breakfast. They were evidence that dissolved ideology more effectively than bombs. By mid-1945, life inside Camp Shelby and other American camps settled into rhythm. Prisoners woke to the sound of bugles or the clang of breakfast trays. They lined up for roll call, then split off to assignments, laundry, kitchens, clerical duties, or agricultural labor. The Geneva Convention allowed non-combat prisoners to work in non-military roles, and the Americans were pragmatic. Idle prisoners grew restless. Working prisoners kept occupied and productive. When the gates finally opened and the women stepped back into a world no longer defined by fences and patrols, they carried more than their belongings. They carried stories, strange, unsettling, and difficult to explain to families who had endured the starvation of post-war Germany. Some carried extra weight on their frames, a visible reminder of the food that had sustained them in captivity. Others carried only the invisible burden of memory, the taste of waffles and peaches, the sound of a soldier's whistle, the way dignity had quietly returned to them in the least expected of places. Back in Germany, the contrast was stark. Cities still lay in ruins. Dresden was a skeleton of streets lined with ash and rubble. Food shortages had only grown worse in the months after surrender, and many families survived on meager bowls of watery soup. For women who had eaten regularly in American camps, it was almost impossible to reconcile abundance with the hunger they saw in their own neighborhoods. Some admitted privately that the meals in captivity had been the most nourishing of their lives. To say so aloud, however, risked misunderstanding. How could one explain that the enemy had given them more to eat than their homeland had been able to provide? Annalise Weber later recalled, "My mother did not recognize me. She expected a malnourished prisoner. Instead, she saw a daughter healthier than when she left." When Annalise described waffles, turkey, soap, and hot water, her mother dismissed it as exaggeration meant to soften her captivity. Only after other returnees shared similar testimonies did belief take root. The stories of abundance carried weight in shattered Germany. Diaries, letters, and whispered accounts spread through towns and villages. For people conditioned to view America as decadent or failing, the testimony of returning prisoners painted a different picture. America was not only powerful militarily, but materially, economically, and socially. The waffles were never just breakfast. They were proof that enemies could be human, and that truth, once swallowed, would be harder to digest than any meal.